Welcome back to this ongoing influx of insight, this beacon of light in a world of spam, the Patrick Coffin Show. So glad to have you back. I'm very happy to welcome back to the broadcast Dr. Jordan Peterson. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto and an author and a clinical psychologist. He was on the show on February 3rd, and it got a big round of interest and stat spikes. So I'm very grateful for his help in launching what you're now enjoying across the world. I was looking at the Libsyn stats, and it's very humbling to see how many people around the world are downloading the show and enjoying it. And today you're going to really enjoy it because we're going to go away from left-right conversation to down into the self and talk about an effective way of envisioning a future that is full of productivity and meaning. Dr. Peterson is the developer of a program called it's the Self-Authoring Suite. We'll talk about the website again and again, and it focuses not just on past, present, and future, but on virtues and how you can, in writing out your story, come to terms with things that have happened to you, the self that you feel you are now moving forward. So, Dr. Peterson, so glad to have you back.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Maybe before we dig into the Self-Authoring Suite, we can get a little update on the situation we first discussed, and that is the University of Toronto's mandating the use of certain pronouns for non-binary and trans people. I know your initial lectures on YouTube went viral and generated a lot of media interest, but also personal blowback against you, and also, counter support. It's a complicated world. Where do things stand now?
Well, I would certainly say that the counter support has overwhelmingly counterbalanced the criticisms and critiques. I mean, back in December, so I launched those videos at the end of September, and they caused a tremendous furor of newspaper articles and online, more online commentary and views than through conventional media. But they also resulted in the university sending me 2 warning letters, taking me to task for my announced refusal to use made-up pronouns, or what I regarded as made-up pronouns like Z and Zer, that I felt were vanguard terminology for the radical postmodernist left, which is exactly what they are. Normally speaking, with the disciplinary process, you get 3 letters and then something more final and determining happens. But the university stopped at the 2nd letter, and it wasn't obvious for a few months whether I would be able to continue teaching, but in no small part because of the overwhelming public support that I received from journalists throughout Canada and then from the general public as well. The university was responding to public pressure, let's say, both ways. When they first sent me the warning letters, that happened as a consequence of their consultations with their lawyers, but also because there was internal pressure on the administration brought to bear by these professional social justice warrior activist types who are unbelievably good at that. It's all they do. And so when that was counterbalanced by public outrage, I would say, the university responded to that as well and decided politely, I would say, and I'm saying this without rancor or anger. I mean, the people that I was dealing with were by no means evil people or malevolent people. They were administrators trying to find a peaceable road through, peaceable and conflict-free road through, whatever that might be. Now, you can debate about whether or not that's the best way to handle such things, but it doesn't matter. I started teaching again in January. I do all my teaching in the first semester. And so I wasn't teaching undergraduates in the fall, just my graduate students and doing my research and so on. But I started again in January, and I was very nervous about that. I didn't know what would happen, if there would be more protests or if there would be people trying to back me into a corner and give me a rough time. But what happened was that the students were exceptionally welcoming. And they've been very positively inclined towards me and happy to be in my classes. And so that calmed me down fairly quickly. And I would say, apart from the fact that I now have far more public exposure than I did before, which is good given that I want to have the opportunity to educate as many people as I can on psychological matters, things have returned to something approximating normal.
In our household, normal is a setting on the dryer.
Yeah, well, yes. I can appreciate that.
One thing I notice is your willingness to put yourself in very uncomfortable places. I don't know anyone on the left side among our social justice warrior brethren who routinely put themselves into a forum where they're outgunned by just numerically of the opinion breakdown of the panelists. And you seem to almost enjoy, doing Yosemite Sam pushback against people. I've watched you in several different, I guess debates is the right word for it, but the other side don't want to do that. They want to silence people they regard as evil, whereas your approach is let's let the marketplace of ideas work itself out, and we disagree, and let's get to first principles.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about that is that it's not out of cowardice philosophically that the people on the postmodern side of the table shut down dialogue. They don't believe in dialogue. Philosophically, I mean, it's one of the tenets of postmodern theory that the idea that accord can be reached between groups of different identity through dialogue is actually part of the patriarchal substructure. So, because logos, which is the root for logic and the root for dialogue, is the most entrenched principle upon which the patriarchy operates. And so to engage in dialogue with an opponent is merely to demonstrate that their position has some validity. There's no marketplace of ideas. That doesn't belong in postmodernist theory. There's nothing but the competition, the cutthroat competition between groups of different identities for power. That's their landscape. And someone once said that everyone is an exponent of some dead philosopher's ideas. And these postmodern authoritarian types are the puppets of Derrida and Foucault and those terrible French intellectuals of the late 60s and 1970s who figured out how to market their Marxism under a new disguise. And they act that out with complete consistency. Even though you can't say that any single activist, let's say, is a full-blown incarnation of postmodernist ideals, if you take 100 of them and watch them act, they're like pixels on a screen. They act out the pattern. And maybe each of them only carries 10% of the pattern or 20%, depending on how indoctrinated they are. But as a group, it's all driven by these underlying ideas. They don't value debate or discussion.
And if you add in Saul Alinsky to that cocktail, then you get the default position of most undergraduate environments in Canada and the U.S., it seems to me. Factories of this idea of shouting down dialogue as worthless or even dangerous, and not showing up because you don't want to even legitimize someone's position by being in the same studio with them.
Right, absolutely. Well, and, one of the things I've tried to puzzle out is how in the world our young people ever got captured by the idea that the proper way to go about transforming the world in a positive way is to wander around outside with signs on sticks and make noise. I mean, people are really, it's such a strange idea. It's like a medieval dance of some sort. It's so distant from reality, the idea that that's the way that you can change complex systems for the better. But we have entire disciplines continually promoting the idea that social activism is the highest form of human activity. And it's pseudo activity. It looks like effort, but it isn't. It looks productive, but it isn't.
I think you're leaving out the black masks and the car burning, which I think really the pièce de résistance of effective dialogue.
Yes. Yeah, well, that also, that the darker end of that allows people to revel in their resentment while simultaneously telling themselves a story about how virtuous they are.
Right.
It's really it's absolutely appalling behavior.
And the anonymity that doing it at night and with the black masks, it's all Kafkaesque.
I figured out how to never have protesters at my talks. It's real easy. I'd recommend this. Hey, all you social conservative types that are listening, always schedule your talk early in the morning. Because the protesters, they're late night creatures, and they're hungover and useless to get the hell out of bed. So
that's good.
If you have your talk at 8 in the morning, no protesters will ever show up. They don't roll out of bed till 2, and they're not even organized to go out and protest until 5. So
that's
it's
good.
really comical. I suggested to the university when we did the debate there that we have it in the morning for exactly that reason. We had one government elected member show up to distribute a few pamphlets, and that was it for protests.
Well, let's go from anonymous to disclosure and talk about the self-authoring suite. I've begun the writing of it. I started at the present, and present virtue because I'm a chicken. I didn't want to go too gnarly because I frankly, even writing so kind of openly, I mean, as a Catholic, it felt like a written confession without absolution. But just the act of disclosing things about even something positive, and I think the virtue I'm working on now is comfortable being the center of attention. And I began to think about why you or the way it's been developed is describe that as a virtue, because growing up, that was always thrown back at me as, oh, you're just the class clown. You've got to always be on, and that's hardly a virtue. But it is in a way. I could not do any communicating. I couldn't speak in front of a large crowd. I couldn't be sitting here if I wasn't comfortable being the center of attention. So now I've just changed my mind about that, and I'm really just at the beginning of it. Yeah.
Glad to hear
now,
that.
I want to get into the data. I want to talk about the 85 students at McGill and your work with James Pennebaker and Rotterdam research, because data like that gets my attention. But how did the idea of writing down your past, present, and future, and almost you're editing yourself too, aren't you? As you recall things, you're filtering the event, and then there's the remembering of the event, and it's hard to kind of separate them out. How did this arise? How did this idea begin?
Well, it had two sources conceptually. I mean, I've been working on the idea that people's perceptual frames are basically have the structure of stories for a very long time. And so you look at the world through a lens, and the lens, if you describe that lens to someone else, you're basically telling them a story. And people really like listening to stories because we like the opportunity to have multiple lenses because they each serve a different function, which is partly why it's so useful to listen to people who don't agree with you, because they might tell you something you don't know that you can then use. So if you talk to people who agree with you, you just hear the same old thing all the time.
Yeah.
So, okay, so one source was the observation that people inhabit stories and find them valuable. And so it's a psychoanalytic idea in part that you act out the story of your life, something like that. Mm-hmm. So you need to know what your story is. And this is something that Carl Jung stressed particularly, because he said if you don't know what your story is, there's always the possibility that it's a tragedy and that you're the fool. So you don't have the option of not being in the story. Mm-hmm. You have the option of determining in part what that story will be. So you can be the hero of your own story, we might say, or a bit player in someone else's story. And you're not going to get a very good part if you pick bit player in someone else's drama. Now, you can forfeit responsibility if you do that, so it has some advantages. All right, so then the next piece of the puzzle was James Pennebaker's work, and he's a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And Pennebaker was interested in testing Freud's theory. So Freud had this theory that if bad things happened to you when you were young, that might have a determining effect on your personality, and that you were likely to repress those events to the detriment of your well-being. Freud believed that if you brought those events forward and discussed them, that would produce an emotional response that he called catharsis.
Mm-hmm.
It would often be accompanied, say, by tears, and that catharsis released the emotional pressure associated with the events and was curative. And so Pennebaker decided to, now there's something about that that's true, even though I think Freud's formulation was flawed. A flawed formulation that moves you in the right direction is a lot better than no formulation at all.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Pennebaker decided to put this to the test. And so what he did was bring university students in and had them write 15 minutes a day, 3 days in a row, about the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And a control group just wrote about the things they did that day. And what Pennebaker found was that over a multi-month follow-up period, the students who engaged in that, call it expressive writing, because he was working on the catharsis model at that time, their health improved. They visited the doctor less frequently. And Pennebaker was very curious about why that occurred. And so he went back into the writings of those whose health had improved the most and coded the words they used. And he coded words for emotional expression, so that would be the catharsis hypothesis. Mm-hmm. But he also coded them for indications of cognitive transformation, like, well, I now realize, or I've come to understand, or that I now know, or I can now see. And what he found was the emotional words didn't predict improvement, but the cognitive words did. And so his hypothesis was that the reformulation of a traumatic or uncertain event into an understood sequence reduced the overall stress load on the person. So a way of thinking about that is, imagine that your brain is trying to compute how stressed you should be. And it wants to know, it wants to make you as stressed as the situation is dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so you might say, well, how dangerous is your situation? And the answer is, if you're a street alcoholic who's on the verge of starvation and it's really cold, you should be really stressed because you're barely clinging on to the underside of life. And so your brain is going to produce a lot of cortisol, and it's going to put you in a position of emergency preparation. And the problem with that is that it burns up your physical resources faster than you can replenish them. And so it basically ages you across all the dimensions of aging you could imagine. It makes you more likely to be obese, more likely to develop Alzheimer's, more likely to be depressed, more likely to get cancer, more likely to develop diseases, you name it, because cortisol suppresses immune function, for example. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you're in a comfortable position and your job is something you've mastered and you have lots of friends and family around you, then your brain is going to notice that pretty much wherever you go, things turn out the way you want them to. And it's going to assume that you're safe, relatively speaking, and that you don't need to be in a state of emergency preparation. Now, imagine that it's a very difficult computational act. And so your mind seems to do something like, imagine that each situation that you've moved through in your life could be considered an element of territory. And then imagine that there's a proportion of territories where things went well compared to where they went badly. Mm-hmm. The higher the proportion of things that went badly to things that went well, the more stressed you should be, because it's an index that you failed to master your environment. And the more that you failed to master your environment, the more nervous and agitated and prepared for emergency you should be.
Okay.
So now when you go back and write about a situation that you didn't master, what you're trying to do is to extract out an account of it that's causally accurate so that you can avoid such circumstances in the future. And then if you do that properly, your brain will think, okay, now you know what to do. We can code that little territory as mastered. And that decreases your overall stress load.
I want to focus on logos here just a minute, because as I was, and I'm looking forward to going through it from my own past and things that have happened to me, I found great solace in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and he was coining the phrase logotherapy. Is it possible for someone, when they externalize some traumatic event, say some negative, scary thing that happened to them, and they get it outside themselves. They mind dump it by putting it on paper, or in this case, in the software. Is it possible that those dark times, those times of pain, can paradoxically become sources of insight and greater courage, because you realize it was distressing, but it wasn't dangerous. I'm here, I'm writing about it, and I can move forward with greater strength.
Sure. That is part of what you're doing is, like, let's say that you had a history of being bullied when you were 10. Well, you might be carrying that with you. I mean, you made a comment earlier today about the fact that you sort of reflexively regarded your ability to be at the center of attention as a fault.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so that was a crystallized story, micro story, that you've been carrying built into you all the way along.
Mm-hmm.
And it's tagged part of the manner in which you exist in the world as negative.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now you're much older than you were when you developed that micro story, but it hasn't been updated. Now you can write it down and you can think, well, wait a minute. Well, obviously that made me bad at sitting down and shutting up and listening. But why does that constitute a virtue anyways? It does if you're in the classroom where everyone is supposed to sit down and shut up and listen.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not by any stretch of the imagination a reasonable sample of what you might need to move forward in life successfully. The school system was set up to train obedient workers back in the late 1800s. That's why everybody's arrayed in desks in rows, why there's alarm bells that go off. And it was explicitly designed to make people obedient. So really, that's still what we're teaching children to do? I mean, you should be disciplined in all of that. You should be able to follow a planned sequence, but there are very few people who work in 19th century factories anymore. So anyways, you go back into these memories that have been codified in a particular way that leave you with a particular view of the world and a self-representation, and reconsider them and update them. So I had a client once, this is a good example of, because you think the past is fixed and unchanging, but it's not. It's subject to reinterpretation. So I had a client once who came and told me that she had been sexually abused by her older brother.
Mm-hmm.
She was very young. She was about 4. And she was telling me the story and being quite distressed by it. And I had this vision in my imagination of her suffering at the hands of, a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or something like that. But I asked her, okay, well, how old was your brother? And she said 6. She was about 27 when she told me this story. And so I said to her, well, look, one story is that you were sexually abused by your older brother. And a 6-year-old is a lot bigger than a 4-year-old, right? I mean, from a 4-year-old's perspective, a 6-year-old might as well be an adult. But I said, well, maybe you were 2 really badly supervised children. I mean, think about a 6-year-old. And it came as quite a shock to her because she had always conceptualized her older brother as this sort of menacing older force. But she also, as a 27-year-old, knew what 6-year-olds were like. And so you could say, well, it was the same event either way, but that's not exactly true.
Yeah.
So there's got lots of parts of a person that are sort of stuck in the past. And you can tell that, roughly speaking, if you remember something that's more than about 18 months old and it causes emotional distress when you remember it. Mm-hmm. It's as if the part of you is stuck back there in the past. And here's a way of thinking about it. So imagine when you face a threat or something unknown. Okay, you learn from that. Now, what does it mean that you learn? Well, it means that that's a domain of information. And you acquire the information and you rebuild your own interior structures of interpretation out of that information. And you elaborate and update your model of the world. So you turn the anomalous or unexpected experience into a slightly different view of the world and a slightly different personality. Now, if you hit a wall that you couldn't get past, your body signifies that as threatening. Mm-hmm. And you've been unable to transform that threat into usable information, which it basically means you haven't been able to get the gold from the dragon. It really does mean that. That's what that story means. And so what you're doing is going back to your past and saying, well, where do all the dragons sleep? And is there something I can do to roust them out now and gather the treasure that remains?
Yeah.
And so, well, more people worked on Pennebaker's paradigm over the years. And it was basically found that regardless of what you wrote about, as long as it was uncertain, the same curative benefits seem to apply. And so the future is uncertain. You can say the future, the unattended future is a source of continual anxiety. So you want to map it. Okay, then there's another line of research showing that if you get people to write out a plan for their life, not for their job, if they write out a plan for their life, their job performance, their academic performance improves substantially, 10% on average in corporate environments. And in our research, the average has been about 25% for university students. And then we also showed, specifically with the future authoring program, which we'll get to in a moment, that it increases grade point average by about 20% and decreases dropout by about 25%, especially for men, especially for lower performing men or ethnic minority men, for that matter. So the future authoring program asks you to first of all, put yourself in sort of a meditative state of mind, so a daydreaming state of mind. And then to imagine that you were taking care of yourself the way that you would take care of someone you cared about. That's not an easy thing to do because people are often very self-critical, but extend to yourself the same courtesy that you would extend to someone that you cared about. And then ask yourself, okay, 3 to 5 years down the road, what do I want my friendships to look like? What sort of people do I want to be around? What do I want from an intimate relationship? How should my family be constituted? What do I want for my career? What do I want? How am I going to take care of myself mentally and physically? How am I going to cope with the temptations of drug and alcohol use? So you think about that, then you write for 15 minutes about what your future could be like 3 to 5 years down the road if it was the way that would be best for you if you were taking care of yourself. Then you flip that around. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I've got every sentence you say, I've got 9 follow-up questions, but I just want to have you keep on spooling and get to the end a little bit.
I'll finish this and then we can have a discussion about it. I'd like to do that. So then you flip the situation around and you think, okay, you have a variety of faults and a set of vengeful thoughts and some arrogance and some desire to make things worse. And everyone knows about that part of them that would go downhill if they let it. So then we ask you to write for 15 minutes about just exactly what kind of hell you could find yourself in 3 to 5 years down the road if you let all your bad habits and resentments and so forth take the upper hand. So then you might say, that gives people something to run away from and something to run towards. And you're sort of maximally motivated. So you might be facing a difficult decision in your life and you think, oh my God, I don't want to go through all the effort it would take to make that change. And then that little hell that you conjured up that you might be heading for will come to mind and you'll think, oh, I better not go there. I better do the difficult thing so I can stay away from that outcome. And the last half of the program asks you to take the positive vision and to articulate why it's valuable. Like what are you aiming for more specifically? Like what are the top 8 goals, let's say? Why would it be good for you if you attained them? Why might it be good for your family? Why might it be good for the broader community? What are the micro steps? What are the obstacles? So partly you do that because you're going to have doubts about your plan. And other people are going to have doubts about it too. And you need to have more reasons for doing it than you have doubts about why you shouldn't do it. And articulation, writing, really, really helps with that. So you can quell those demons in your head that are always trying to undermine your movement forward. You can out-argue them, basically, because smart as you might be, you can probably only come up with about 5 doubts. And so if you have 6 reasons for moving ahead, you win. And you win in a discussion with someone else, too.
So you're propelled from the hell, but you have a heaven, so to speak, just to keep the analogy clean.
Exactly.
You're free from something, and you're free to something.
Exactly.
So, it's interesting. You're talking about the virtues and changing your mind about the way certain traits were labeled by others. When I first stepped right into the definition of humility, just a couple of years ago, I always assumed humility meant, oh, woe is me, I'm just a little worm. I have no gifts and talents, and that's humble. Well, that's actually false humility. Humility is the truth about yourself. No grandiosity, but also no BS about how horrible you are. And it's interesting how we can be ruthless with ourselves in ways that we would never be with someone we cared about.
Oh yeah, that's very common. People almost inevitably have a self-destructive critic in their head. You know, Freud talked about that as the negative part, the tyrannical superego that's just beating you down all the time. And of course, you know your flaws more than anyone else does.
Yeah.
So you can really go after yourself.
I'm sure you've heard of the concept of critics' math. It's a story told by comedian Larry David, the creator of Seinfeld and Curb Your Enthusiasm. He found himself at a Dodgers game. He was in whatever shows how much of a baseball fan is. I am. Brooklyn, New York, Mets. He's at a Mets game, and someone saw him in the stands, and they showed his face on the Jumbotron, and 30,000 New Yorkers said, Larry, the local boy who went to Hollywood and became hugely successful. And he remembers, he said this in an article in Rolling Stone magazine. He's walking back to his car after, feeling the love of 30,000 New Yorkers for him. And this gang of yahoos drives by him, and they recognize him. They say, Larry David, you suck. So guess which event he ruminated over for weeks, right? The yahoos completely obliterating a stadium full of palpable affection for him. And I think there's a temptation to do that. So the critic's math is 99 compliments plus 1 criticism equals 1 criticism mentally.
Right. Well, part of that too is that, we're wired up basically so that we feel a loss of a certain magnitude more keenly than we feel joy at a gain of the same magnitude. And the reason for that is because we err on the side of caution, right? Something that hurts you can kill you, whereas something that's good for you can just make you happy. So pain hurts more than pleasure feels good. And it's self-protective, but it can really go astray in exactly the manner that you just described. So, and also people also often radically underestimate how much trouble other people are or are in. So they look at themselves and the problems in their life, and they're embarrassed about it. They don't talk about it. And so they think that everyone out who's on the street smiling, which is first only a tiny fraction of the population to begin with, because there's lots of people hiding at home. Yeah. Those people are wandering around and they're completely successful and they don't have a care in the world, which you just have to scratch the surface of someone, generally speaking, to find out that that's the farthest thing from the truth. Yeah.
Is part of the success in the self-authoring suite with underperforming men and freshmen generally at the undergrad level, is part of the success rooted in the fact that they begin to pick different friends when they see their own promise? There's a famous phrase by Jim Rohn: "You are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with." Do people recalibrate who do I want to hang out with? Because if that should happen whenever you make a big transition in your life, right? If you're aiming upward. You're like the alcoholics don't hang out at the tavern anymore, and they realize half their friendships were just booze bonds, which are no bonds. Right. It could be all their friendships. Yeah. Which is one of the reasons why it's very difficult to stop drinking, because you have to stop being with all your friends. It leaves a big hole in your life. But I think we've puzzled over why it works better for men a lot. Now, part of the issue is that on average now, men are underperforming women in most academic domains, right from junior high through university. But I think it's this. I think that because men and women have different personalities, men are more disagreeable than women.
they're not as compliant, they're not as compassionate, they're not as polite. Although women have higher levels of negative emotion, men are more, what would you call it, more competitive and more self-determining in a sense. And
yes.
So that's positive.
More overtly combative.
Yes, exactly. So my sense is that men just won't do anything unless it's their own plan.
Yeah.
So I think, and I think that's how it should be. If you're going to motivate a young man, you don't necessarily say, well, you should do this because it's a good thing, or you should do this for others. Some men will respond to that, the more compassionate types, but the more competitive types will say, no, I'm not interested in that. It's like, I'll just do what I want. I'm going to do what I want. Mm-hmm. Well, they don't know what they want, so they play video games and they don't go to university and they don't go to college. But if you get them to think through what they want and why, then all of a sudden that disagreeableness is given a direction, and then they can be unstoppable under those circumstances.
Can I tie this back to the notion of story, your life as a story? It seems to me that when I look at my own past, my own times when I was very sad, and sometimes unremittingly sad, maybe even Islamic depression type sad, didn't seem to have an object to it. And looking back at those times, I felt, in retrospect, like I've lost the narrative thread of my life. I'm in the stands, and who's that? Oh, that's Patrick. Wait a second, I'm supposed to be in the game. I'm supposed to be the protagonist in the story.
Yeah.
Is this a correct reading of the tea leaves here, that when you lose the narrative thread of your story, you're going to be prone to feeling depressed?
Well, that's exactly right. So look, the fundamentals, there's a fundamental story, which is something like a person was somewhere and they wanted to be somewhere else because it was better, and so they went there. Mm-hmm. Like that's the most basic story, and you're always inside that story because you're always where you are, which isn't quite good enough, trying to get to somewhere else that's better. And you have behaviors that will make that transformation. And you construe every environment through that lens. Okay, but then the question is, well, that's your story. And it's nested inside another story. So you're doing this interview in principle because you want the show to go well. You want to post it on YouTube so lots of people can see it. You want to do that because it's a public service and because it'll further your career. You want to do that because you're trying to make your way through life, and maybe you're trying to be a good person. And so each of those stories is nested in a larger story. When those stories collapse, which is what happens when they fail repeatedly, the higher the level at which they collapse, the bigger the pit that you fall into. And that's a mythological journey to the underworld. Mm-hmm. And so the meta story is, you're in a story, something comes up and blows it into pieces. And then you fall into the underworld. And down there's chaos and hell. And the chaos part is just not knowing which way is up and being swamped by uncertainty and anxiety and depression. And the hell part is the bitterness and resentment and anger and homicidal impulses that sort of suffering will generate. And so...
But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, then you wander around down there with any luck and put yourself back together. You pull, you pick up the pieces and you move on. You generate new you that has learned from the collapse, if you can manage that, and then you move to the next stage of your life. But our lives are punctuated by these descents of different magnitude from order into chaos. Order fragments, chaos. And sometimes that can be enough so you're just done. Mm-hmm. But most of the time it's not. You learn something from that dissolution. Maybe you learn not to be so arrogant, so narcissistic, or you learn some new skills. You broaden your viewpoint if you can. You've been beat up a bit, so you're wiser. You put yourself back together. Hopefully you're more robust the next time if you didn't get hurt too badly.
Could you say that the elixir is in the hell, and you have to, the gold from the dragon thing? I'm a very amateur student of Joseph Campbell and his The Hero's Journey and how it applies to screenwriting and storytelling. And he talks about the descent into the inmost cave where it's the darkest. Blake Snyder calls it the whiff of death scene. Every film, if you time it, just within 5 minutes of the midway point, there'll be the all is lost, Christ on the cross moment. It can't get worse. It's just the utter rock bottom. And that becomes the first note in this new symphony, this new acquisition of hope and a perspective you didn't even dream you could have, but through going through that hellacious experience. Is that?
You're doing that in a micro way when you go back into your past and find places that are still bothersome.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those descents can be of different magnitude. In a screenplay, which is a pseudo-mythology, like it's a story on its way to being a myth. That's what I'm thinking about it. Yeah, there's a crisis point. And if it's a tragedy, if it's a tragedy, it falls apart and stays that way. Like the hero doesn't always recover, right? I mean, you get a story like Hamlet where things start off bad and just get worse. There was a famous musical, Dancers in the Dark, that was out about 10 years ago. That was like a reverse Busby Berkeley musical. Because in a Busby Berkeley musical, everything started out pretty good and got way better. People needed that in the Depression. And this was Lars von Trier, if I remember correctly. And he started out with this girl who was going blind and working hard. And things just went from bad to worse for her in the most horrible possible way. And then the movie ended.
Yeah, it sounds like Manchester. Yeah.
Sorry?
It sounds like Manchester by the Sea. And it's a movie for people who don't care about hope at the end of really horrifying, sad movies.
Right.
They'll never make it into a musical. But yeah, reverse Busby Berkeley is a good metaphor.
Yeah. And so, but the typical story is challenge, fragmentation, descent, confusion, and maybe an encounter with evil. Mm-hmm. Then the acquisition of new wisdom and maturation and the reformulation of a new identity. And that's a death and rebirth. That's why part of the reason why that there's a very old idea that the Redeemer is someone who dies and is reborn. Because that's what people are doing in small ways and big ways throughout their life if they're going to maintain their progress forward. You have to let the old part of you that is no longer properly alive die. And that's painful. It's really a small biological death, but allowing that to occur enables something new to flourish.
So die, not negotiate with it, not have it hang around and disturb you. It must die.
Well, it's complicated because there's always a process of death, but it can be, like if you keep yourself updated on a day-to-day level and you're really attentive, the deaths and rebirths can be small but continual.
Yeah.
The reason something has to die is because if you make a mistake, then the way you looked at the situation was wrong. At minimum, it has to be altered at its microstructure, transformed at its microstructure so that it becomes a new thing. You have to let the old die off, and it's painful. I think that's part of the reason we experience emotional pain.
Is coming to terms with those small deaths, kind of dying each day, Christ says, take up your cross, not weekly, monthly, or yearly, but daily.
Yep.
Can that lead to the end or a cessation of the fear of death itself? Does that put your relationship with death on different footing? Because it's been somewhat domesticated because you've practiced it and you've seen the fruits of it. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the evidence for that is quite clear. If you take people and expose them to things that they're afraid of and that they're avoiding, but these are things that are causing troubles in their lives, it's not just random exposure to danger, although there are conditions under which that might work too, because that's a challenge. You find that the more people expose themselves voluntarily to small dragons, the better they get at dealing with big ones. And the reason for that isn't so much that they become less afraid, it's that they become aware that they have more courage and ability than they thought. They become aware that there's more to them than they knew. And so you could say, in some sense, that process of encountering the unknown is part of the process by which your possibility reveals itself to you. Because if you're very sheltered, you have no idea what you're like because you haven't been tested.
Right.
You're going to think you're harmless and useless. And it's possible that you're neither.
Sometimes it seems that while we can also misgauge traits of ourselves that we've always assumed were negative and see a positivity there, we also I think, misjudge other people in their virtues. I used to think that some people were just born patient. Well, I don't really believe that. I think that people who are patient are the ones who are dealing with the feelings of impatient, but they wear the mask. They don't display, oh, this is so annoying. Whereas, I'm more, you're ticking me off, so I'll just say it. I'll kind of blurt it out, and therefore I label myself as impatient. But aren't the virtues those strengths, those powers that kick in the presence of their opposite? So someone who's chaste is chaste. Really, they only know that when they're experiencing some sexual temptation, but they're saying no to it. Yeah. Therefore, you can't really be chaste when you're windsurfing or reading a magazine somewhere.
Right. Well, I think you're given some virtues as gifts, but they come with their accompanying vices. But you also have to earn others. And so it's something that Nietzsche actually concentrated a fair bit on in his discussions of morality as cowardice. And Nietzsche said quite frequently that morality was cowardice, but he didn't mean that there's no difference between being moral and being cowardly. What he meant was that if you're afraid to do something, then it's best to mask that in a cloak of virtue. So if you're chaste because you're terrified of the opposite sex, that doesn't constitute a virtue. But if you're fully functioning sexually, and you're also attractive to people, which is also an element, so you have to be sexy and dangerous to some degree, and then you decide that you're going to take control of yourself, well, then that constitutes a virtue. So, the temptation has to be there for a virtue to even exist. So, and it's easy for people to deny that, and so they confuse their inability. I never get angry. It's like, well, that doesn't make you peaceful. It just makes you weak. So you have to be capable of the vice before you're capable of the virtue.
And how marriage complicates all this too.
Well, what are you thinking about with regards to marriage?
I'm thinking about how helpful it would be if my wife were to do the self-authoring suite as well. So we would kind of be tracking this self-disclosure. My wife and I have this, I'm sure you've heard of this. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. It has to do with to-do lists. Well, the self-authoring suite seems like a to-be list.
Yes, exactly. Well, and it is, I think, very useful for couples to each member of the couple should have a vision, because that keeps each person alive and interested. And then there should be a joint vision, which is the way those two visions tie themselves together across time. That really is what the bond is. It's you're laying out that story across time, and you have someone to reflect it back to you and to perfect it as you move through time. And that gives you two brains, which is really one of the major advantages to having a stable long-term relationship, is that you actually have someone you can talk to.
Yeah. Hence the phrase, the two become one, where you get out of the dual track of I'm for you and you're for me into that mysterious third thing that we call our love, right? That almost quasi-Trinitarian bond between you. Right. Just loving the same thing together.
Right. Well, one of my friends from northern Alberta went to Scandinavia to get married, and they had an interesting ceremony. I only heard about it, but in the ceremony, the wife or the bride and the groom held a candle above each other, jointly held a candle above each other's heads. And the candle, it was a Christian marriage ceremony, the candle signified Christ. Okay, so the question is, what does that mean? Well, it means that the two, who's in charge of a marriage, the man or the woman? It's like, no, wrong. It's the better being that both them could be that's in charge of the marriage. And so that's signified by the candle, a symbol of illumination held aloft, is we're both subordinate to a higher third principle, which is what we could be if we got the information flow working properly between us, because you can see my blind spots. I can see your blind spots. You can help me learn to see. I can help you learn to see. And the two of us together seeing will be a different being than the two of us apart blind. And you need to know that about a marriage in order to take it properly seriously, because Otherwise, it's more merely an act of convention. I'm not putting it down as an act of convention or anything like that. It beats the alternative, hands down. But to also do it consciously and to understand that you now have someone to whom you can and should tell the truth. Mm-hmm. And then undergo the transformations that will produce, because it will produce plenty of transformations, that's for sure.
There's a book about this by Fulton J. Sheen called 3 to Get Married. It's beautifully summarized by this, the candle held aloft. Notice not equalized and not down on the table somewhere. It's a lovely tradition.
Yeah, it's very intelligent, and it's associated with the idea of the candles in the Christmas tree, which is, of course, the rebirth of the sun at the height of at the depths of the winter. And so, it's illumination and vision, and both people should be subordinate to those principles. It's exactly right.
And aren't both freed by submitting to that higher thing? Because I think a lot of parents have because their view of marriage is a little bit askew, their relationship with their kids is a little bit askew. If you think of a higher principle as your bond, then children actually come third in that arrangement. So you're dedicated to providence, to God, whatever label you want to put on it. Then you're in that union, you're united to your spouse, and then both of you are able to self-donate to your children rather than separate invisible threads of love, which can be cut and retied and so on. It's not as organic.
And manipulated, right. Yeah, it's definitely the case that what the child needs to see, is some variability between the parents, of course, but they need to see what's essentially something monolithic and united. Mm-hmm. Because the children will, of course, separately torment each parent, looking for cracks in that unity to play off against one another. It's part of their social exploration. And if the bond between the two parents isn't primary and elevated, then the children find weaknesses and can exploit and even drive wedges through the structure of the family. They play one parent off against the other.
Looking for cracks in the dam.
Absolutely, and they should do that because it's part of their exploratory behavior, even though if they're successful at it, it's certainly not good for them.
Well, this has been very good for me, and I know it's been good for our listeners. I always learn a ton when I speak with you, Dr. Peterson. Thanks for creating this self-authoring suite. The website, by the way, is selfauthoring.com. I'm going through it myself. I'll be journaling from time to time with you about my progress and regress and how scary and fun and ultimately insightful it all is. It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for being a gift, and keep on punching in all charity, of course.
Yes, well, thank you. Look, thanks very much for the second invitation. It was very good talking to you. And as soon as you have it up, let me know, and I'll tweet it and all those things.
Great.
And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk again.
That would be great. That from your lips to God's ears. Thanks very much, Dr. Peterson.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, this is Patrick Coffin. Click on the link, subscribe, rate and review, keep in touch, stay connected. Be a saint. What else is there?